Chapter 5. "Let me go!" I struggled against her, but she was damnably strong for a woman. "I've had quite enough of being restrained today." I went to smash my heel down on her toes, but she predicted my move and jumped back without letting me go. I said, "Why are you here and why are you spying?" The deep, almost masculine voice, coupled with the smell of tobacco, made me wonder if she was in fact a he after all. "My name is India Steele and I'm not spying. I'm a guest of Mr. Glass's and I'm looking for the privy." Her grip loosened enough for me to wriggle free. I turned on her, unsure whether a smile or admonishment was in order. In the end, I couldn't control my wide-eyed stare. She was definitely a woman. Her figure was as curved as mine, and certainly couldn't be mistaken for a masculine one. Yet she wore loose men's trousers and a man's leather waistcoat over a plain white shirt. Her black hair had been arranged in a relaxed style on top of her head, as if she'd slept with it like that. Even dressed in masculine attire, she had a pretty oval face, despite the scowl and pursed lips. "The privy's that way." She jerked her head in the opposite direction to Mr. Glass's room. "Thank you." I tried to edge past her, but she caught my arm. I shook myself free and matched her scowl with one of my own. "I really have had enough of being waylaid today, thank you. Kindly allow me to pass." She merely folded her arms and widened her stance. "I'm not sure I should until I've spoken to Matt." "Matt?" "Matthew. Mr. Glass." So she was on a first-name basis with him too. I suppose I should have suspected. I decided to change tactics and thrust out my hand. "Since there's no one about to make introductions, shall we just introduce ourselves?" I smiled. Her scowl deepened. "My name is India Steele." "So you said. And you are? Not trusting you." I withdrew my hand. "May I ask why?" Her scowl disappeared. She cleared her throat and looked somewhat less sure of herself. "You talk like a proper English lady, but you don't dress like one." I didn't tell her that she talked like a woman and dressed like a man. Until I knew how she would accept such quips, it was best to keep them to myself. Particularly since I was in something of a precarious situation while living in the house of a man I didn't trust. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You're loose in the general area of your pups." "Pups?" She indicated my chest. "Oh." My face heated, and once again I found myself folding my arms over my breasts. "That's why I need the privy. I'm in need of a sewing kit and a private room." She considered this by twisting her mouth to the side. Hands on hips, she turned and walked off. A few paces away, she stopped and looked over her shoulder at me. "Come on, then." I followed her. "Thank you, Miss Willie Johnson. Call me Willie, not Miss anything. Got it?" Yes, you stated your wishes very clearly." She stopped and rounded on me, her face only an inch from mine. "Are you having a joke at my expense?" I tried not to splutter at the stench of tobacco on her breath. "Not at all." I hoped she believed me. She may be a woman, but I didn't feel any safer with her than with Mr. Glass's other servants. She seemed fiercer than Duke. Tell me, Willie, are you the housekeeper here? Or the cook, perhaps?" She blinked at me, then burst into raucous laughter that had me stepping back to avoid her breath. "Me? Cook? Not likely. They'd rather starve than eat my cooking. As to cleaning, no thanks." She snorted, then wiped her nose with the back of her hand. I was beginning to wonder if she'd been raised by wild bears. "There you go." She jerked her head at a nearby door. I opened it, but didn't go in. "That's not the privy." "It's my room, or one of them. Matt gave me the ladies' suite, as he called it, even though I said I didn't need this much space." She indicated I should go in ahead of her. My needle and thread are in there, but I've thought of something better. I went in ahead of her. The room was a large sitting room with chaises longues positioned beneath a window, a table, 2 armchairs by the fireplace, tea table on wheels, a writing desk, an empty glass display cabinet. The sage green and cream-striped wallpaper matched that of the sofa, and it all matched the tiny green flowers on the curtains and cushions. It was far too feminine for the woman standing beside me. Perhaps that was why it looked like it wasn't used. It smelled like it too, all stale and close. No tobacco, though. Willie closed the door. "Come with me to my bedroom and undress." She indicated an adjoining door. "Go on, don't get all prim and missish now." I followed her to the bedroom door, but didn't go in. This room didn't smell unused. Indeed, the scent of lilacs was quite strong here. "I'm not being prim. I'm simply wondering what you have in store for me." Willie rummaged through a large trunk at the end of her bed and pulled out a brown cotton dress with a lace cream falling collar. She shook it out and held it up for me. "It's real ugly, but it'll fit you." We were of a size, true, and while the dress wasn't overly pretty, it wasn't ugly either. It had no embellishments whatsoever except for the large collar. It was certainly in a better state than my buttonless gown. I would guess it had never been worn. "You're loaning it to me?" I asked her. "Keep it. I don't wear dresses, corsets, and ladies' things. A girl can't run in them or holster a gun on her hip." "True, but they're excellent if you want to trip someone over." She gave me a blank look. "Your feet can't be seen beneath these skirts." I gave her a demonstration. "I'd rather run or fight." I sighed. Sometimes so would I. I took the gown and she left me alone to change out of my dress and into hers. It fitted well, although was a little short. My ankles were visible. My mother would have made me change out of it if she'd been there, but she was long dead. Besides, beggars couldn't be choosers. I was checking over my gown to see if any damage had been done to the fabric when Willie walked back in without knocking first. "Christ, it's just a dress. What's taken so long?" "I'm finished." Willie scanned me head to toe. "It's still an ugly dress, but it looks better on you than me." Thank you, I think." "Leave your outfit in my sitting room and collect it later. I suppose I should be offering you refreshments, seeing as you're a guest and all." "Thank you. A cup of tea would be lovely." I was parched after my exertions, and now that I once more felt suitably attired, I was ready to face the household over a cup of tea. I only hoped Mr. Glass didn't rest for long. I liked his company and felt more at ease in his presence. His servants, or whatever they were, made my nerves jump. Willie led the way back down to the drawing room, then disappeared after ordering me to "wait here." She managed to infuse the words with Steele so that I didn't dare move. She clearly didn't trust me. And I didn't trust her, or any of them. But I would bide my time, for now, and continue investigating later. It wouldn't be wise to get caught outside the drawing room again. I strolled around the room, which was as pretty as Willie's rooms, although done in blue and gold colours. It too had a stale smell to it, however, that had me wanting to open the windows. After a few minutes of idly inspecting the knickknacks up close, I couldn't stand it any longer. I unlatched one of the window sashes and opened it. I breathed deeply and watched the glossy black coaches rumble past with distinguished-looking gentlemen inside. Elegant ladies dressed in fine gowns walked with parasols in hand to protect themselves from the spring sunshine, and nannies pushed perambulators along the pavement. Nobody hurried. No shopkeepers shouted about how wonderful their wares were, and delivery carts didn't jostle one another for space. It was quite lovely here in Mayfair. A coach pulled up out the front of number 16, and Duke hopped down off the coachman's seat where he'd been sitting next to Cyclops. Cyclops spotted me and waved, but Duke, following his gaze, frowned. "What'd you open the window for?" he called out. "Fresh air," I called back. "You call this air fresh?" He looked skyward and screwed up his nose. "You English are mad." I heard the front door open before he'd even reached it. I leaned out the window to see who'd opened it for Duke, but couldn't quite see. "Better?" Duke asked. "Stop fussing," came Mr. Glass's response, "and keep quiet around Miss Steele." I couldn't hear if Duke warned him that I was standing at the open window or not. The door closed, and a moment later they both strolled into the drawing room. Mr. Glass looked much refreshed. His eyes were bright, and his skin had returned to its normal colour, not pale or lit up by veins of purple light. He smiled at me. I smiled back, wondering if Duke was supposed to be quiet about the strange watch or something else. "I see you've changed, Miss Steele," Mr. Glass said. "You must have met my cousin." I felt the heat in my cheeks rise again at his reference to my attire, even though he didn't mention the reason behind the need to change. Yet I was glad, too, that he'd acknowledged my change of clothing without dwelling on the matter. Indeed, he'd managed to seamlessly change the subject. It was a smooth transition, and I wondered if it had been designed that way to alleviate my embarrassment over our earlier encounter. "Willie is your cousin?" I asked. "On my mother's side." "She didn't tell me that. Indeed, she didn't tell me much at all. I thought she was a servant." Mr. Glass looked pained. "Did she threaten you?" "In a way. But then she gave me this dress, so I suspect everything is fine between us now." "Wouldn't wager the ranch on that, Miss Steele," Duke said. "She hates dresses. Way she'd see it, you're doing her a favour." "Then perhaps we can be friends, since friends do one another favours." Duke burst out laughing. "She ain't never had a friend. All the girls are scared of her back home, and most of the men, too." Mr. Glass nodded. "It's true. She terrifies even me when she flies into a temper. But don't worry, she's rarely home. It's unlikely you'll see much of her while you're staying with us." "Speak of the devil," said Duke, as Willie walked in carrying a tray laden with teapot, cups and slices of cake. "And look at that, she's gone all womanly on us too, and made tea. Must be the influence of having a real lady in the house. You're lucky I'm holding this tray, Duke, or I'd clock you for that." Willie set the tray down with a loud clunk that rattled the delicate china. Duke chuckled. "I got a room to make up and lunch to prepare. Come and help me, Willie. Do it yourself, I ain't the maid. Do I look like I'm wearing an apron?" "Duke," Mr. Glass snapped. "Enough. Willie, do whatever you want, as usual." Duke left, chuckling, and Willie served the tea. The small smile on her lips suddenly faded, and she straightened, even though she hadn't finished filling the second cup. Tea spilled onto the saucer from the spout. "What does he mean, prepare a room?" she asked. "Miss Steele is without lodgings at present," Mr. Glass said. "I offered her a room here until our business is concluded and we leave London." She glared at him, then turned that glare onto me. "Did you force him into this?" "No," I protested, eyeing the teapot. A white-knuckled grip on the handle looked ominous. It wouldn't surprise me if she used it as a weapon. "You're a dang fool, Matt." She thrust the teapot in his direction, causing the tea to slosh around inside. "A chit bats her eyelashes and flashes her puppies, and you're falling over yourself to help her?" Mr. Glass's nostrils flared. "Don't," he growled. "Well, it's true," Willie sniffed. But some of the wind had been knocked out of her sails. "Even more true when she's all helpless, like Missy here." "Excuse me," I said, rising. I wasn't tall, but I was taller than Willie. Unfortunately, my superior height didn't concern her. She watched me with an air of amusement, as if she thought my attempt at intimidation was laughable. First of all, I am not helpless. While I may be without steady employment or accommodation, I can assure you that it's only temporary. Secondly, I didn't flash anything at Mr. Glass, and batting eyelashes is ridiculous. No self-respecting woman would do it. Willie smirked. Seems we agree on something. I'll finish pouring the tea, Mr. Glass said. You may go. Willie folded her arms and sat heavily on the sofa. She sprawled on it with her legs apart, as if she were trying to take up as much space as possible. Considering I'd been sitting on it, I suspected her aim was to force me to move. I squashed myself into the corner, my skirts brushing her knee as I did so. I'm staying here, she announced. You might need saving from her, Willie, he growled. Get out, or I'll cut your allowance in half. She sat forward, hands on her knees, then pushed herself up. No need to be so mean. I'm only looking out for you, like you done for me so many times. He sighed and dragged his hand through his hair. It was the most harried I'd seen him all day, and considering what a day it had been, that was quite surprising. I know, Willie, but right now I need to speak with Miss Steele. We've got work to do, and I'd rather not waste another minute. Willie bit her lip, then suddenly threw her arms around her cousin. The sudden burst of emotion surprised him as much as me. His brows rose, and he took several seconds before he gingerly patted her shoulder as if she were a dangerous animal he wasn't sure how to pet. I'll be helping Duke if you need me, she said, pulling away from him. Try not to pick a fight with him. I will, if he will. Mr. Glass sighed as she walked out of the drawing room. She's quite a little whirlwind, I said. More like a tornado. But he smiled as he picked up the teapot and continued pouring. I am sorry for her behaviour, Miss Steele. Willie is difficult. She's certainly a unique character. Her upbringing wasn't ideal for a young woman. I didn't meet her until we were both 15, and by then it was too late. She was already set in her ways. She's been dressing like a man since before she was 15. While at Willie's age was difficult to gauge, I gathered Mr. Glass to be in his late 20s when he was in good health. Earlier, before he'd gone upstairs, he'd looked much older. She has, and acting like a man, too. Why? He handed me the teacup, but didn't meet my gaze. She found it easier to be a temperamental, foul-mouthed man than a temperamental, foul-mouthed woman. I sipped my tea and set aside thoughts of Willie. They were replaced with thoughts of my new employer and his remarkable recovery. He couldn't have slept in the brief time we were apart, so his restored health must be due to the glowing watch. I'm glad to see you looking much better, I said. I didn't expect you to be up and about for some time. You looked very ill earlier. If he didn't tell me about the watch now, then he must certainly want to keep it a secret. I keep a tonic in my room, he said, his gaze holding mine. A little swig and I'm cured. He smiled easily. If I hadn't seen the scene with the watch, I would have been completely taken in by his charming manner. I know it's not my affair, he continued, sitting down in an armchair opposite me. But since I'm a sort of accomplice, I'd like to know what that business with Abercrombie was about. You claimed not to know why he accused you of theft, but surely there must be a reason. I don't know. Truly, I don't. The whole episode was very strange and troubling. Father never liked him, I do know that. He called Abercrombie a pompous prig, full of self-importance. Abercrombie's quite rich, you see, and wields a great deal of influence in the Watchmakers' Guild as its master. What is this guild? It's one of several craft guilds that have been in operation for centuries here in England. The official title is the Worshipful Company of Watchmakers, but no one calls them that nowadays. There's an engineers' guild, a tailors' guild, a carpenters' guild, a jewellers' guild, and dozens of others. Everyone who creates something and sells that creation must belong to a company. It's the law. No membership, no license to sell. Don't you have them in America? There are organizations in different states, but they're not as controlling. Is the guild's only function to determine who can and can't sell their goods? Well, they also take care of the widows and families of deceased members with hardship funds and issue awards for quality workmanship. A member is only eligible for the award if he enters, of course, and there's a fee for entry, but the winners' names are published in all the major newspapers and journals. The custom that generates can be enormous. Who decides on a winner? The guildmaster and other members elected to the committee, which is known as the Court of Assistants. It may not surprise you to learn that Mr. Abercrombie has won the Best Watch and Best Clock award for the last 3 years. Did he cheat? He probably bought votes or made threats. Is that why your father disliked him? One of the reasons. I swirled the tea slowly around my cup and tried to suppress the well of despair that always threatened to spill over whenever I thought about father, the guild, and losing our shop to Eddie. When father became ill, he encouraged me to apply for membership. He knew that in order to keep the shop operating on my own after his death, I would have to belong to the guild. They refused my application. Did you have the necessary qualifications? Of course, I've been father's apprentice for years. The entry test requires the applicant to disassemble a watch mechanism and put it back together again. It's very simple, and I would have passed easily, but I wasn't given the opportunity. They threw out my application without even considering it. Why? Because I'm female. He considered this with a frown. But I've seen female shopkeepers here who I'm sure make their own wares. Dressmakers, jewellers, milliners. Don't they need to belong to their respective guilds too? They do, but their companies allow women. The Watchmakers Guild doesn't. Why not? You ought to ask them. It's ridiculous. I'm an excellent watchmaker, but they seem to think I would make an inferior product and devalue their reputation. It still made my blood boil to think about it. Their logic was flawed and archaic, but there was nothing I could do. An overhaul of their bylaws could only be started if all members agreed to a vote. Ah, I see now, he said. See what? Why your father left the shop to Hardacre. He must have seen it as the only way to keep the shop for you, assuming you would soon marry him. Except that we didn't marry, I bit off. Eddie tricked father and me too. I would never be tricked again by a two-faced, lying little turd. He must have been quite believable, he said quietly. He was, but it doesn't excuse my own blindness. The truth was, I'd wanted to believe that Eddie loved me. I was 27 and had never known the affections of a man. A year ago, I'd given up hope of marriage and embraced spinsterhood. And then Eddie breezed into my life with his easy smiles, handsome face, and eagerness to please. Nothing was too much trouble or too dull, from accompanying me to the market to watching me fix a clock in the workroom. Yet he never laughed at the jokes I laughed at. I should have taken that as a sign that he wasn't for me, at the very least. A lifetime without laughter would have been sheer drudgery. It was a testament to my desperation that I agreed to marry him, despite his lack of humour. Mr. Glass set his teacup down and shifted in his chair. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and I wished we hadn't raised the subject of Eddie at all. I concentrated on sipping my tea until finally Mr. Glass spoke. Does the Watchmakers Guild keep records of previous members? I suppose so, but I'm not sure how helpful their register would be in finding your watchmaker when you don't know his name. I think we can be quite sure it isn't Kronos. Agreed. He sighed. Shall we discuss the route we'll take this afternoon? He pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket and moved his teacup aside to make space on the table. The paper turned out to be a map of London. "Are you sure you're up to going out again this afternoon?" I asked. His shoulders tensed. "Of course, there's nothing wrong with me. But the map, Miss Steele. Please point out where you think we should go next." I sighed and studied the map. "We'll try the area south of Hyde Park and over to Westminster," I said, drawing a circle with my finger around the area. "That should be enough for today." "Out of the way of Oxford Street," he said with a nod of agreement. "Yes," I said quietly, "well away. We'll stop by the Masons and retrieve your belongings while we're out. And mention the trouble Mr. Abercrombie is trying to stir up. I couldn't bear it if they heard the rumours from another source first, or if Mr. Abercrombie approached them looking for me." "He won't pursue the matter." He folded the map and returned it to his pocket. "You can't be sure of that." He gave me a crooked smile that was full of mischief and mystery. "Yes, I can." The afternoon's visits brought us no closer to finding Mr. Glass's watchmaker. Fortunately, I was neither attacked nor snubbed, although that could have been because I remained in the carriage most of the time. I only got out at Mr. Healy's shop to stretch my legs and see how he fared. He'd been a good friend to Father and kind to me on the day of the funeral. I wanted him to know that I was well. I was relieved when he greeted me with a smile. We stopped at the Masons' home in the late afternoon, and Mrs. Mason welcomed us with a cup of tea and slices of walnut cake. "Gareth, take this to your papa and brother in the shop," she said, handing her son a tray laden with teapot and cake. Gareth disappeared, and a few minutes later Mr. Mason returned alone, carrying his teacup. He greeted us with strained smiles and shook Mr. Glass's hand. "Any success?" he asked. "Not yet," Mr. Glass said. I was glad to see that he wasn't overset with tiredness this afternoon. He looked quite well. "But Miss Steele assures me we've only scratched the surface. I had no idea London was so large." "It's Europe's grandest city," Mr. Mason said with a puff of his chest. "Aside from Paris," Catherine said dreamily. "I do so wish to see Paris one day, don't you, India?" "I've never thought about it before," I said. "I suppose so, but I doubt I'll ever leave London. I only speak English, for one thing, nor do I know anyone outside the city." Catherine huffed out a small breath. "You're so conventional all the time." I blinked at her. By conventional, I suspected she meant dull. Was that how she saw me? As a prim spinster with no dreams, no ambitions or hopes? Was that how everyone saw me? "Paris is indeed a beautiful city." Mr. Glass's rich, deep voice broke into my self-centred thoughts. "You've been there?" Catherine leaned forward, her teacup pausing on its way to her lips. "I lived there many years ago." "How thrilling!" "That's enough, Catherine," Mr. Mason chided. "Mr. Glass has more important things to discuss in your flights of fancy. Paris is not for the likes of you." Catherine slouched back against her chair with a pout. I gave her a sympathetic smile, but she looked away. The conversation stalled, so I decided to get to the point of our visit. "Mr. Glass has offered me lodgings in his house," I told the Masons. "I've come to collect my things." Catherine's jaw dropped, but she quickly recovered. "Marvellous. Come upstairs and we'll fetch them together." Mrs. Mason tusked. "I'm sure the arrangement is all very respectable," she said, "but I feel I must protest. What will people think?" "India knows what she's doing," Mr. Mason said quickly. "Don't fret, my dear." His wife glared at him. He sipped his tea. "They won't think anything because nobody I know will find out," I said hotly. "Even if they do, does it matter? My future is already ruined. Eddie saw to that. A little scandal won't taint me further." Mrs. Mason humphed and bustled about, collecting teacups and plates, her cheeks pink. No doubt she was contemplating all sorts of lurid scenarios involving Mr. Glass and myself. They were probably similar to the ones I'd contemplated myself, particularly after the corset incident. Sometimes my skin still felt as if it bore the impressions of his hands. "I understand your concerns," Mr. Glass said, "and I'm glad Miss Steele has good friends in you both. But rest assured, my cousin, Miss Wilhelmina Johnson, is staying with me and will act as chaperone. She's a respectable, responsible woman of high moral character, and will ensure that Miss Steele is treated with courtesy at all times. Miss Steele, would you say my description of Willie is accurate, based on your first impressions?" They all looked to me. Fortunately, my cheeks no longer felt hot, but I had a devil of a time keeping a straight face. Willie probably would have fallen over with laughter herself if she'd heard her cousin's description. "She's all that and more," I assured the Masons. "She's very sweet and kind." Mr. Glass smiled at me. Hopefully I was the only one who noticed the wicked gleam in his eyes. "I intend to look for more permanent lodging and employment in the coming days," I said. "I don't want to burden your good selves any further." "You're no burden, India," Catherine said, touching my knee. "Not at all," Mrs. Mason said, after an awkward moment. Her husband sipped his tea. "That's settled then," Catherine said, standing. "Come, India, let's get your things." Up in her room, she helped me pack, while I told her that the hem of my dress had come down, so Willie had loaned me one of hers until I could repair it later. She hardly seemed to be listening. "He's so lovely," she eventually said, closing my valise and fixing the clasp in place. "Mr. Glass? I hadn't noticed." "Tosh, of course you have. And to think you're going to stay with him in his house. What an opportunity!" "I know what you're referring to, Catherine, and I think you've gone mad. I'm not going to throw myself at Mr. Glass." "Perhaps he'll throw himself at you." That had us both laughing until we collapsed on the bed, out of breath. Once recovered, we headed back down to the parlour with my valise. I touched Catherine's hand before we went in, wanting some sort of reassurance from a person I knew and trusted. Despite our laughter, I was anxious about staying in Mr. Glass's house. He and the other members of his household were nothing like us. They were bold and brash, and they talked about holsters and pups. They could be outlaws. I could be walking into something too deep to dig myself out of. Catherine squeezed my hand in sympathy, although she didn't know the real reason behind my anxiety. She must think me nervous about the possibility of ravishment. Catherine and her parents walked us to the door. I hugged each of them in turn and promised to see them again soon. All except Mr. Mason hugged me enthusiastically. "One other thing," I said before we left. "Has Mr. Abercrombie been here asking after me?" "Miss Steele, there's no need," Mr. Glass said with a hard glare and shake of his head. "It'll be taken care of by the morning." "Abercrombie?" Mr. Mason said. "No, why?" "It's of no consequence," Mr. Glass cut in. "Actually, it is," I said. "He tried to have me arrested for theft." "Good Lord!" Mrs. Mason pressed her apron hem to her chin. "That's awful!" I briefly explained the event and assured them I hadn't stolen anything from him. "I just wanted you to know from me before you heard it from someone else." Although Mr. Glass had assured me everything would be taken care of, I couldn't see how. I needed to protect myself, and that meant involving the Masons. Of course, Mr. Mason nodded excessively, which only set his jowls off like a bowl of jelly. He looked quite worried, and that had me worried. "If Abercrombie does come here looking for you, we won't tell him where you've gone," his wife said. I smiled at her and tried to catch her husband's eye, but he wasn't looking at me. "Thank you." Mr. Glass stored my valise at the back of the coach while I climbed inside. He climbed in after me, and the coach lurched forward. "It wasn't necessary to mention the incident with Abercrombie," he said. "I will see that he doesn't trouble you again." "I don't see how you can do that. Perhaps if you shared how you would see to it, I might have more faith." He plucked off his gloves, finger by finger. "I have some influence in this city." "But you've never been here before." "That's irrelevant." I clicked my tongue. It was easier to get answers from statues. "Forgive my doubt, Mr. Glass, but I find it difficult to trust someone who doesn't give satisfactory explanations." His brow crinkled. His gaze locked with mine. "I hope that's not true, Miss Steele." His low, deep voice rumbled from his chest. "I don't want you to feel unsafe in my home." "Oh," I waved off his concern. "That's another matter entirely." "I know Willie, Duke, and Cyclops are different to you English folk, but you have my word that they won't harm you." "I'm glad to hear it." "Unless you cross them." I went very still. Did he know that I suspected him? Was he warning me not to act on my suspicions? He smiled, and I didn't detect any falseness in it. Not that I was an expert at reading people. Look how I'd been taken in by Eddie. We arrived back at Mr. Glass's Mayfair home, and I was glad to see that my room was ready. It was spacious and decorated in wallpaper of pink climbing roses with matching cushions on the bed. It commanded a pretty view over the street, way down below. I'd never been up so high, and looking out of the window made me feel uneasy. I stepped back, but kept it open for the air. The room, like many of the others, smelled stale. It would seem the house had been shut up for a long time before Mr. Glass's arrival. Someone had laid my dress on the bed, so I emptied my reticule of the buttons. I found my sewing kit in my valise, but quickly ran out of thread. With a deep breath to fortify my nerves, I left the room to go in search of Willie. I hoped she wouldn't accuse me of spying again if she came across me outside my room. I headed down a flight of stairs to her suite, but no one answered my knock. She was probably in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal or helping Duke. I gazed up the corridor towards Mr. Glass's door, but decided against knocking. He might be resting. I made my way down the winding staircase to the ground floor and peeked into rooms. All empty. The kitchen was below ground level, and I finally found the door leading to the service stairs hidden in a wall near the back of the house. Voices filtered up to me. First Willie's, then Mr. Glass's. I paused on the last step upon hearing Willie's stinging words. "I don't like her," she said. "She's a hoity-toity miss who thinks she's better than all of us." "You're being childish," Mr. Glass chided. "Miss Steele isn't like that at all." Willie snorted. "Why'd you bring her here anyway? You could have paid for lodgings somewhere else. She didn't have to come under our roof." "I agree with Willie," said Duke. "Letting the Steele woman live here is dangerous. She might see something she shouldn't." "Or Matt might do something he shouldn't," said Cyclops with a deep chuckle. "Shut your trap, Cyclops," Willie snapped. "Matt ain't interested in the likes of her. What's she got to offer him that other ladies don't?" Cyclops' low chuckle filtered out to me. I wished I could see the others' reactions, particularly Mr. Glass's. "I wanted her here for a reason," Mr. Glass said. "Not that reason," he added quickly. "There's something about her. I can feel it. Or rather, the device can." "The device can?" Duke echoed. "When she's nearby, the watch becomes warmer. I can feel it through my shirt." "That's ridiculous," Willie said. "It can't do that." "How would you know?" Duke sneered. "But Matt, is that all? Does it glow or something?" "No, but I'm convinced she's more than a simple watchmaker's daughter. She must be, Or why would all the other watchmakers in the city be afraid of her? Afraid of me? That was overstating it a little. They did seem unnaturally wary of me, however, for reasons I couldn't fathom. Even Mr. Mason. The only one who treated me as he'd always done was Mr. Healy. "She's staying here," Mr. Glass announced, "because she's of use to me. So be nice. All of you, Willie." Was that why he was being gentlemanly to me? Was that why he'd saved me from Mr. Abercrombie's clutches? Because he suspected I was useful to him? While I'd never expected to become friends with him, I had thought we shared an amiable connection. Now I wasn't sure what I felt, or whether I could trust his pleasant manner. It sounded like it was all an act to lull me into trusting him. But to what end, I didn't know. I had nothing worth stealing, and there was certainly nothing special about me, no matter what he thought. Nothing special at all.